Hello there, it's me, Harry, and this is part 4 of the Infogrames Atari Mega Collection. Boy, we're on to part 4 now. In this part, we're going to be taking a look at games from 2003 to 2004. There's going to be lots here, so let's go! And today we're going to be starting off with essentially what is a cliffhanger ending to the previous one, the GameCube version of Micro Machines, which came out in January of 2003. 2 months after the PS2 and Xbox versions. And just like the Xbox version, this only came out in Europe. Don't know why this came out later than the others, as I said in the previous part, but yeah, could have been Infogrames' decision or something. Maybe the GameCube didn't sell well. Furious Karting, a game from Babylon Software. So this is essentially like a realistic kind of kart racing game, but it's got a lot of juvenile content in it, aimed towards a teenage audience, because that's what they like, right? And by the time February rolled by, Unreal finally got its true sequel, Unreal 2: The Awakening, developed by Legend Entertainment, a self-owned developer of Atari. And yet this game was still handed off to Epic Games once their deal with Atari expired, and eventually Midway Games republished it, and then they republished it themselves until all the classic Unreal and Unreal Tournament games were delisted. Obviously, because Epic Games doesn't really care about anything these days but Fortnite and nothing else. Seriously, they like to milk on that bandwagon, I'd say. Here's another movie tie-in game that came out many months after the original, the GameCube port of Men in Black 2 Alien Escape, which, I'll be honest, they could have just scrapped this version entirely, or they released it earlier. So this version was ported by Taurus Games, based on the original Infogrames Melbourne House version of the game. It's still the same exact thing, with the same issues and everything. So, they might as well have just, as I said, ignored it entirely. Battle Engine Aqualia, from the company Lost Toys. This game was a pretty poor seller for Infogrames and Lost Toys themselves. Like, it's got a nice futuristic feel to it. It's interesting as a shooter game, but it just didn't sell well, and eventually led to the PC version that was planned being sold off by Infogrames to another publisher. But here we are, here's the Xbox version as well. Both of them are the same game, as per usual. It's very rare for, PS2 and Xbox games that were released simultaneously to have extra content or things like that. Same with GameCube, but this game didn't have a GameCube release. Racing Evolution Zone, from the company Milestone, who, as you may know already, do quite a lot of racing games already. And this one actually has a bit of a different take on the racing game scene, where you actually get to create your own company that makes racing cars, and you get to race them against rivals and all that. So a pretty interesting take on the racing game genre as a whole. I forgot to mention in the previous section that the failure of Battle Engine Aqualia caused Lost Toys to go out of business. Although, I don't know if it may have been related to that, or it may have done, but I would say it may have been the case. The GameCube version of Monopoly Party, yet another late release for the system, and overall being a game that had such a strange release as a whole. As I said, this is as confusing as Titus's own releases. Sonic Mega Collection, the debut of Sonic the Hedgehog's Mega Drive games onto the GameCube. And one of the very rare cases of an Infogrames distributed game that has their logo on the front, but they still technically did not publish this. It's still a Sega published game that they distributed. And yeah, that's all I really need to say. You got some fun Mega Drive Sonic games, and yeah, it's sort of lacking compared to Mega Collection Plus that came out in 2004, but still, can't go wrong with this. And the last Sega game I'll be showing off in this series is House of the Dead 3, an arcade game port. So, the funny thing about Sega back then, when Infogrames was distributing their games, or Sony, depending on the release, is that normally they'd use the Xbox to release sequels of their Dreamcast games. So like Crazy Taxi 3, Sega Rally 2002, and Panzer Dragoon Auto, and of course this game. While they would use the PS2 to port their Dreamcast games over, and the GameCube would normally see family-friendly games with some occasional Dreamcast ports. Quite odd if you'd ask me. But maybe it was a good thing for them. Master of Orion 3. So this is yet another North American release that simply had the UK age rating stickered over it. And Infogrames called it a day. It's a sequel in the Master of Orion franchise by Microprose. Obviously, there's no Microprose branding anywhere because at that point the brand was pretty much phased out. And this is normally classified as one of the worst games to come out from Infogrames during this time. And the worst entry in the franchise. And here's the jewel case, which doesn't have any front insert whatsoever. It's just a back insert in both of the discs, and on the back there's an ad for Civilization 3 and the Play the World expansion. What you also got inside was a fully fledged manual that feels more like a mini book, and a little keyboard guide. And then we have the Deadly Dozen sequel. Would you call it a sequel or a spin-off? I don't know. Deadly Dozen Specific Theatre. So, yeah, once again, it's the same style box as the other one. US packaging, but with a little ELSPA sticker on there. Because Infogrames didn't have any care or in the world to do their own version of the box. Or DVD case or whatever they wanted to use. And here's the jewel case, which does have a front insert manual and its disc, and it also advertises a game called Tiger Hunt on the back, which I don't think came out in Europe. But there's no back insert at all. So Master of Orion 3 had one, but no front, but this game has a front, but no back. Coincidental? I think not. Zappa One Wicked Cricket from Blitz Games. Originally meant to be Frogger 3, but Konami got back the license, and so Blitz Games had to redevelop it with an original character, and so that's why it plays exactly like Frogger. And although I've had this game for many years, this is still the only version I have. I don't know why I've not been able to find the Xbox or the PS2 versions, or why I haven't even bothered to buy them, but yep, here we are again. The Xbox port of V-Rally 3. So, a couple of months after the PlayStation 2 version came out, Infogrames announced this Xbox version. It is the same game as the original, just with a different intro video and some slightly different graphics, and yeah, it's still the same game. Now, here is a very strange commission. Roller Coaster Tycoon on the Xbox. It came out months after the second game did, so why did Infogrames or Frontier Developments, who did this version of the game, even bother? Well, it didn't sell well, but you can still find it pretty easily. And it does look like the original game, but these kind of games just don't work with controllers. It's just very hard to control the game and construct coasters and all that. Like, you can get used to it, but it's easier just to use a keyboard and a mouse on the original PC version. And that version's better anyway, so yeah. At least you have the expansion packs. It would have been even more bare if they weren't included. And speaking of Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, here's the game's first expansion pack, Wacky Worlds, which has scenarios based on different locations across the world, as the name suggests, and is from Frontier Developments, although the packaging does not make mention of this. Superman Shadow of Apocalypse, the GameCube version. This was actually one of my luckiest finds I've had whilst collecting video games. I found this pretty cheap on Amazon one year, and that's surprising because you can barely find this game for under £15 these days. This game goes upwards for about 80 or higher. And that's shocking, considering this is a port of the PlayStation 2 version, which I haven't rebought yet. I used to have it many years ago, but I sold it. And, yeah, there is some additional content added in. So, Now, one of the most overhyped video games of 2003, Enter the Matrix, hyping up the second and the third Matrix films, but it was more or less a side story that didn't even feature Neo in it. So here's the PlayStation 2 version. The Xbox version, which was originally intended to be like a console exclusive of sorts when Interplay originally had plans to publish this game, but then because they suffered through many financial issues at the time, they sold it to Infogrames and they sold off Shiny Entertainment to them as well. Even the GameCube didn't get left out by this game as well, especially since it was included on 2 discs because of the GameCube discs not having as much space as a DVD would. And here is the PC version, which came in a slip box that had 2 DVD cases inside. One had 3 of the install discs, the other one had the play disc inside. Although there was a later DVD release of the game that wasn't sold in the UK or Europe. And here is the Best of Atari release from 2004, which added in a later rendition of the game that had some extra mini-games in it. The PlayStation 2 version had an update similar to that as well when it was re-released as a Platinum title. Although the GameCube and the Xbox didn't, though. They were the same versions as previously, even with the re-release. Ikaruga, a port of the arcade game from the Japanese developer Treasure, one of the hardest games ever. And, of course, Infogrames brought it over to the GameCube in all 3 territories, surprisingly enough. But still, a cult classic game, one of the most expensive GameCube games you'll find, even back then, even now, even whenever, but it's still great to own this cult classic of a game. And the GameCube version of V-Rally 3, once again the exact same game as before, just with some minor limitations I can guess because of the GameCube discs. And this version didn't come out in North America, it was only released in Europe and Japan, strangely enough, which got the PS2 version as well. Neverwinter Nights Shadows of Undertide, the first expansion pack for the original Neverwinter Nights. Once again from BioWare and some other developer I've forgotten the name of. Introducing some new story elements and things like that. And here is the Best of Atari re-release from 2004. Which, as I said before, is the same game, like with every other Best of Atari release, but without a physical manual that's instead a PDF file, and that's it. Line of Sight Vietnam, another shooter game. So this was right after Infogrames rebranded as Atari, and as such, you know, their names on the front and the back of the packaging. From M-Fusion Interactive, like with the Deadly Dozen games. So this is sort of like a spiritual successor or something along those lines, but it has no relation. So, yeah, one of the first games released under the Atari name, like fully, in Europe, but it still uses the older Infogrames era Atari logo on it. And yes, Atari published a game on the PS1 in 2003, and it's Beyblade Let It Rip. A port of a Japanese game from 2001, which was released by Crave Entertainment, I think it was, in 2002 in the States, and then Atari released it in 2003 in Europe. Yep, 3 different publishers, one pretty bad game. They could have just skipped this game entirely, but since, you know, kids loved Beyblade at the time, of course they had no choice. Here we have Enclave, which I think was the first game in Europe that had the new 2003 Atari logo on it. So this was a game originally meant to be published by Swing Entertainment, who published the Xbox version of the game, but they went into some sort of liquidation, I think it was, and so they sold the publishing rights to Atari for the PC version in Europe. It had already been published by Vivid Universal in the States, so that didn't change at all. And it's pretty obvious that it was like some sort of kind of distribution kind of thing, because Atari's logo doesn't appear on the game at all, aside from the packaging, so yeah. The first official debut of Atari's new logo on screen was the Temple of Elemental Evil, another Dungeons & Dragons game, but rather than taking place in the Forgotten Realms universe, it takes place in the Greyhawk universe. pretty unique for a Dungeons and Dragons game, especially, as I said, most of them are set in the Forgotten Realms. Sinbad Legend of the Seven Seas, another Best of Atari re-release. Although, this could have been the original in Europe. I've never been able to find an original release of this game. Maybe I have, but I don't remember seeing any. But yeah, this is a PC game based on the DreamWorks animated film. The one that almost caused DreamWorks themselves to go out of business before the animation division split off as a separate company and saved them. But it's what it is. And then here's the second and the last expansion pack for Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, Time Twister, which is essentially, making parks through time. More or less like an expansion of Wacky Worlds, but yeah, set within the ages rather than the world. Now we're finally on to more console games, and here we are with Dragon Ball Z Budokai, a port of the PlayStation 2 game of the same name with enhanced graphics and some additional features. So this is the first in the series as a whole to be a Bandai published game. Bandai was a long-term partner with Atari. Atari distributed their games in Europe, and as such, that's where we come in. Although, Atari did publish Dragon Ball games in North America and Australia until 2009 as a whole publishing thing under Funimation, whilst this game being under Bandai was under Toei Animation or something along those lines, or the AB Group, whatever the license holder for Dragon Ball was in the UK or Europe at the time. Here we are with V-Rally 3 once again. This time, it's the PC version which only came out in Europe as a whole. And this version is actually pretty buggy and glitchy. It wasn't really optimized very well for PCs. A shame, really, because the other versions of the game for the PC, V-Rally 1 and 2, were pretty decent in some way. Dungeons & Dragons Heroes from the Microprose studio in Hunt Valley, then named Atari Interactive Hunt Valley Studio, and the last game they developed before they closed down. This is a hack and slash game. It was originally intended to be a multi-platform release, but Atari decided to release it for the Xbox only. Maybe it worked better that way or something. And it makes a change from the usual typical RPG elements most Dungeons & Dragons games are based on. As I said, this is a hack and slash. Magic the Gathering Battlegrounds, another Wizards of the Coast licensed game. Or, well, Hasbro. But they're the same thing. So this is a fighting game based on Magic the Gathering, which is odd, once again, for a RPG-style game. And if you can see, the spine is a bit sun-faded as well. But it doesn't really matter. To the point that it was also released on the PC. So that means you can have a good old fight in double the platforms. Yeah! Maybe. Heading back to the world of the Romans now, with Asterix and Obelix XXL. A game developed by Outrages Libres. I can't pronounce that right. It translates to Strange Dragonflies. So yeah, I'll still pronounce them by the original name anyway. So this is an action-adventure game where you can either play as Asterix or Obelix and battle those Romans, because they're crazy, of course. Although it does slow down quite a bit, and it's pretty obvious that the later released GameCube version, which you'll see later on in this video, was the first version of the game as a whole. Now, since there was Malice and Vex and a bunch of other similar platforming games, Eden Games decided to come up with one on their own, which is Kea Dark Lineage. And it's a pretty decent game as a whole. A bit difficult at times, but still a pretty interesting 3D platformer. Another take on Beyblade, this time based on the V-Force series, called Super Tournament Battle. It's very similar to the other Beyblade game, to the point that it's almost pretty much the exact same game, maybe. I haven't really experienced much with both, so I can't really tell. Civilization 3 Conquests, the improved version of Play the World with some better multiplayer functionality and even more civilizations than ever before. What more could I say about this game other than the later sequels, but still, It's Civilization 3. Well, since they already had the Terminator video game license, Atari wouldn't have not made a game based on the then new third entry in the series, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, developed by the company Black Ops Entertainment, which is kind of odd because, they weren't a self-owned developer of Atari, but Atari still went with them anyway, and their self-owned studios helped out as well, but it was still a typical movie tie-in game. I'd say the only good thing about this game was that it had some hidden Atari arcade games you could play that were unlockable as you progressed, so yeah, that's it. It's a movie tie-in game, and not a very good one at that. Terminator 3 War of the Machines, so Atari decided to release a separate PC game than the console experiences, so it's still based on Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, but it's more or less like its own thing. It's a shooter game on par with the very first Battlefield game, developed by a company called Clever's Games, although this game isn't exactly that clever. Mission Impossible Operation Surma, yet another movie tie-in video game. It wasn't based on any Mission Impossible film as a whole, but it was, based on the films in general. So here's the PS2 version and the Xbox version, and this is yet another game where the GameCube version came out a lot later despite it already being complete at the time. Neverwinter Nights Hordes of the Underdark, the second and final expansion pack for the game. But there's still going to be some more Neverwinter Nights content in the next part. So it's not like this whole journey's over yet. Now we're on to 2004, and here we are with Atari 80 Classic Games in 1 from Digital Eclipse. Yet another Atari arcade game compilation video game, and had the most Atari games out of any of the compilations at the time, some making their modern debuts in this case. So this is another re-release. I can't find the original release of the game. Don't know if it exists or not in Europe. Maybe it did, but I've not been able to find it at all. Tonka Firefighter from the company Boston Animation. So even after the, Infogrames rebranded as Atari, they were still releasing Tonka licensed games with Tonka Joe and all that. And this time, you're getting to control. Well, it's pretty obvious. The name says so right there. And featuring Chuck the Dump Truck is Tonka Town. Yep, even before the Adventures of Chuck and Friends was a thing, but even then, Chuck was a toy from the start. And as per usual for a kids game, it was developed by Imagine Engine. What haven't they done that's not a kids game? Well, they actually have done a non-kids game before. You'll get to see that later on. Here is Unreal Tournament 2004, the expanded and proper, fully released version of Unreal Tournament 2003. And in the UK, it came out in both CD and DVD releases. So this is the CD-ROM version, which was Atari's last game to come in this style of thick box. And here is the DVD-ROM version, which came in a standard DVD keep case. One disc for that. The CD-ROM version had 6 discs, I think it is. Yeah, I'm right about that. Thomas and Friends Thomas Saves the Day, the last of the Thomas and Friends PC games from, this whole partnership of Hasbro Interactive, Infogrames, and Atari. Developed by Stump Puppy Entertainment, much like with Building the New Line, which I don't have. And then eventually all these games were re-released by Mindscape under a licensing agreement from Atari. Although eventually Mindscape would get the rights as a whole. So I don't even know who owns the rights to this game. Maybe Atari owns it, but I don't know. Maybe the administrators of Mindscape do. And here we have yet another Best of Atari re-release that I don't think had a full release as a whole, and it's the game Ballance. So think of Going Balls, that mobile game except much, much better. And a bit harder too. Developed by a company called Dale or something, I can't pronounce it. And they did expand on the game a little bit, and it does have a digital re-release. And here is the GameCube version of Mission Impossible Operation Surma. As I said before, it's the same game, it just came out a little bit later. For some reason that I don't even know. And from Human Head Studios is this Western-themed shooter game called Dead Man's Hand. And it also came out on the Xbox, but I don't have that version yet. I'm still trying to find it. Although it likely wouldn't be that expensive anyway. It's one of those kind of games. And hey, look, 2 discs. The Xbox port of Unreal 2 The Awakening, ported by Australian developer Tantalus, which I think have recently gone out of business as of when I'm recording this. Although it was pretty obvious that the Xbox just wasn't powerful enough for a game like this, and the loading times and things like that perfectly represent this version of the game. The same reasons that Half-Life 2 suffered from as well when it was ported over to the original Xbox. My Little Pony Best Friends Ball, a game based on Gen 3 of My Little Pony, and I bet you can guess who developed this game. Oh, come on, you can guess. Yep, it's Imagine Engine. Unsurprisingly. And this actually came with a little baby pony figurine that was exclusive to the game that you could play around with in the game itself. So, yeah. Transformers, based on the Transformers Armada anime series, developed by Atari Melbourne House. So, while their first attempt at a shooter game wasn't that great, their second attempt was a much better improvement under the name, because I know they have done shooter games before, so... Yep, that's that. And there was also a director's cut version of the game, which I have seen before, but I have not bought it, nor have I found it again after that. Shadow Ops Red Mercury from Zombie Studios, and was Atari's first game using THX sound capabilities, which is what consoles would use at the time. And it had some online, online shooting action and all that. It was essentially like a Call of Duty style game under the Atari banner. And there was a later PC version of the game which I'll show you later on. No pun intended. Asterix and Obelix XXL's GameCube version, once again from Utrages Lubriz. There was a PC version as well, but I don't have that. It's, as I said, it is essentially a better running version of the original game, because of the GameCube being more powerful than the PlayStation 2. Driver 1 and 2 double pack. So this was a PlayStation release from 2004, so this was another late release, and the only one under the Atari name as a whole. It was essentially just a re-release of the first 2 Driver games, intended to, capitalize on the release of Driver 3, which came out around the same time. It also came with a Driver 3 demo DVD of sorts, but my copy does not have it. But yeah, quite odd seeing, the Driver cover art with Atari's logo on it instead of GT Interactive's. And then here is Driver 2. It has different disc artwork than the original release does. I used to have the original releases, but I don't anymore. And then here we are, the manual with its Atari branding on it. Interesting, I'd say. Interesting. And then here is Driver 3 itself. And it was buggy and glitchy at launch, even though it had been in development for 4 years, and Atari attempted to bribe 2 gaming magazines for fake ratings, and yeah. One of the reasons that Atari fell under the sewer hole. And that sticker on the Xbox version was one of those magazines that Atari had bribed. The other thing I'll also add in is that the PS2 version has a demo for Transformers, but the Xbox version does not, because obviously that game wasn't released on there. Risk Global Domination, another Hasbro licensed game. This is a real-time strategy game similar to the original Risk. You know, it's an adaptation after all. And it's from a company called Cyberlaw. It was meant to be released earlier on, like in 2002 or 2003, but it kept getting delayed. Because there was adverts from, you know, in Infogrames games at the time that did promote this game. And it did have cover art with their logo on it. But of course, since it came out too late, here we are. Chris Sawyer's Locomotion. So after doing the first 2 Roller Coaster Tycoon games, Chris Sawyer decided to return back to a Transport Tycoon kind of title. And here we are with Locomotion, which wasn't exactly perfect at launch, but with programs like Open Locomotion, or whatever it's called, it's a much more improved game. And it does sort of work well as a successor to Transport Tycoon, even if it does focus more on engines. But who doesn't love trains? Obviously I do. T2 Mega Compet, or Tutoff Mega Competition, as it's translated to in English. So this was a French-only party mini-game compilation based on the T2 TV series itself, based on a Belgian comic book series. So yep, Atari goes back to the Belgian comics with this title. But since it's in French, I don't really understand a thing. Although, it was re-released by Microids and had an English localization for the first time. So yay! I can understand a few things better. And with the poor reception of the Terminator 3 video game itself, Paradigm Entertainment takes over and doing a sister game to Terminator 3 called The Redemption. Maybe that's referring to it being a redeeming title over the previous Terminator 3 video game. Here is the Xbox version. Once again, same game as before. Don't need to say anything more about it. Just let it move by. And the GameCube version, which the original Terminator 3 video game missed out on, Atari cancelled its release in order to focus on the development of the other versions of the game. Pretty odd, but it may have also been due to poor sales or something. This was the last of Atari's native releases in Europe to be released on the GameCube, but there is one more that will be in the later part, but it's a Bandai title. Forgotten Realms Demon's Stone. So this was a Dungeons & Dragons experience on consoles again. And it was a pretty unique one, actually, that it was made for consoles from the start, similar to that other Xbox game. And yeah, the other versions of the game didn't actually come out until later on, oddly enough, so you'll get to see the PC version later on in the next part. Junior Sports Basketball. So out of all the backyard sports games that Atari decided to localize for Europe, they decided to localize this one as well. So it's a port of backyard basketball on the PS2, just with all the NBA licensing taken out, and all the kids are voiced by British voice actors. The PC version of Shadow Ops Red Mercury, which came out later on than the original Xbox version. It's still the same game though. Trivial Pursuit Unhinged. So this is one of the rare cases of an Atari published game based on, well, it wasn't really a Hasbro property at the time, it was owned by Horn Abbott, but it's one of the rare cases of something associated with Hasbro, published by Atari that wasn't under the Hasbro license. There was an Xbox version of this game as well, but it didn't come out in Europe. But a PC version sure did. Although it's still the same exact experience as before. I should really stop saying those kind of things, but I do have to make it entertaining. I do need to let out my voice in there somehow. Don't want to make it too quiet. Dragon Ball Z Budokai 3, the only game in the original Budokai trilogy that was not on the GameCube. You'll get to see the second one in the next part. So this is pretty much the best version of the original Budokai games. Although it does have some differences that were more in compared to the US version of the game. So it has the English voices, no Japanese ones, but there was the later re-release of the game that did include them. The Platinum release of the game has them as well. So this is yet another Bandai published game. Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, the original boxed release of the game. I have to hold it up because it won't balance on the display stand. You screamed, we went faster. The very first Roller Coaster Tycoon game in full 3D. Chris Sawyer wasn't involved in its development, he was only a consultant. It was developed by Frontier Developments, who would later go on to become a big name in the roller coaster construction and management simulation scene. You get to see the expansions in the next part. Right, here's the thing case. That kind of, has the disc inside and all that. And then here is the manual. I'm just covering up the serial number. And then it has an ad on the back for, Sid Meier's Pirates, which you'll be seeing in the next few minutes. Driven to Destruction from Monster Games, a Test Drive spin-off, which doesn't have the Test Drive name at all in Europe. It was still under that strange conflicting deal where the US division could use it, but the European division couldn't. A very fun racing game, actually. You get to destroy things. It's sort of like another kind of Destruction Derby kind of thing. Axis and Allies, another game licensed from Hasbro. And it's another one where the box won't balance because the box is in quite bad condition, from the company Timescale Studios. So it's a real-time strategy game as well. And that's kind of makes sense because it is World War II and all that, and you need to lead your soldiers to all sorts of different places. Duel Masters, based on the Wizards of the Coast card game of the same name, which was turned into an anime series. And then it was turned into a PS2 game developed by High Voltage Software. And it's exactly what you could expect for an adaptation of this card game. Although it wasn't as popular as Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And maybe, once again, this may have existed because, Wizards of the Coast used to publish Pokemon cards in the US and Europe, and then the Pokemon Company got the rights in 2003. So this had to fill in the gap somehow for Wizards of the Coast. Godzilla Save the Earth from Pipeworks Software, and this is the second of the 3 Godzilla trilogy games that they developed. So the PS2 missed out on Destroy All Monsters Melee, but they got Save the Earth, whilst Nintendo missed out on it. And here is the original Xbox version. Both are the same game. I think they have the same amount of monsters you can fight as, comparing it to Godzilla Unleashed, which had slightly different monster selections between both the PS2 and the Wii versions. But I don't have that game on either platform. Another thin box game because it's way too heavy, Sid Meier's Pirates. So Atari initially published this game, and then a couple of months later Take-Two Interactive took over once they bought out the Civilization franchise from Infogrames. So yeah, pretty odd to have this under the Atari name. I think their logo, probably appeared on it, and then in later updates it was swapped out for 2Ks. And yeah, it's even copyrighted under Atari. So maybe the copyright was moved over to, Praxis and Take-Two. And here is the jewel case inside. Enjoy seeing it spin around like a record baby, round and round. Yeah, I made a silly funny, didn't I? And then last but not least in this entire part is Atari Anthology. So we started off with 80 classic games in one, and we ended off with Anthology, which is very similar to 80 classic games in one, but removes a small selection of games and adds some as well. Ones that were more suited for a computer, they were taken out, and ones that were more suited for a console were added here. Same developer, Digital Eclipse, and it had some online capabilities as well. The Xbox version came out first, and then the PS2 version, which you'll be seeing in the next part, came out later. And here we are. That's another very long video done and dusted. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time in the next part, where we'll be taking a look at games from 2005 all the way to 2007. Anyways, hope you enjoyed it as I said. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.